And then, at time t, we have again 2 individuals. So what happens in the meantime? Well, it's not difficult to guess. Well, many of them die shortly, and many of them die in misery. So for instance, if you think of the picture I put there before, well, many of these animals that come to existence never make it to sentiency. So they die before they are ever sentient. So for instance, actually some eggs are destroyed. Fair enough, that's fine. But many of them do end up being sentient. And most of them die very shortly after. It's not that they live for some months and they die afterwards and just when they're about to reproduce. It doesn't work in this way. Most of them die shortly after they come to existence. And how do they die? Well, many of them simply starve. Others are killed by predators or die for other reasons, right? And dying in this way is not something quite desirable, right? It's hard to die when you starve. And of course we could say, well, you know, but they aren't sentient as we are, or as, you know, other animals are. And yeah, maybe this is so, or maybe I should skip the maybe. Maybe we can accept that this is definitely so. But still, there are so many animals that when we put together all that amount of suffering, well, you know, it's a great deal of suffering. And what about the happiness that we can have to counter this? Well, they don't have many opportunities for enjoyment in their lives. They just come to existence, suffer, die. So this is the reason why for many animals, or for many animal species, suffering greatly outweighs happiness in nature. As I said, suffering is thus maximized for these animals. And what happens is that R selection is vastly prevalent in nature. K selection is just an exception. All invertebrates follow R selection as a reproductive strategy. Among vertebrates, those animals that are more numerous, like for instance, say fish, and then fishes, reptiles, and amphibians, they all follow R selection as well. Even among birds and mammals, most of them combine R selection and K selection. So, for instance, mice would take care of their offspring, but they will have huge progenies, and most of them will die, right? So their situation is not as hard as that of those animals who are born out of clutches of millions of eggs, but still, I mean, it's not exactly like ours. So this is a problem because this entails that you know, we have strong reasons to consider that suffering is definitely the norm in nature. And as I say, most animals have huge litters or clutches. And let me put some examples of this. Bullfrogs can lay up to 20,000 eggs. Cods, or cod, well, you can use cods because it's anti-species, because you don't use the uncountable for animals. Well, they can lay up to 9 million eggs. And then some fishes, 300 million eggs. So, okay, let's make some moderate estimation and assume that just 1 out of each 100 of eggs develops into a sentient being, which is of course not a reasonable assumption at all. Many more would. Still, this would mean that 3 million animals are going to suffer a great deal for a couple of them to survive, right? So, as I say, most species follow this reproductive strategy that entails that most of their members die very soon. Okay, so this is what we can conclude. But not only that, in addition, adult animals don't live in wonderful conditions either. They suffer greatly due to all these reasons. I mean, from malnutrition to disease to injuries. And actually, we may think, well, maybe these are the exceptions, but they aren't. I mean, these animals can suffer for many reasons, and many of them are suffering constantly. So this is why I conclude that the idyllic view of nature is wrong. Actually, why I conclude that it's very wrong. And as an example of this, this is the final conclusion. As an example of this, I want to put this this picture of this deer. You can see that it's not quite fat. And this is really the norm among many of these animals in places where predators are around, even when food is available for them. Because when predators are around, what happens is that what population ecologists call ecology of fear takes place. So these animals won't dare to go to places where they could feed because they are scared of predators. So they have done research on this, for instance, when they compared the situation of animals such as deer. Again, I know in proper English is deer, but because they aren't uncomfortable, I would use the word deer. So they tested how these deer were faring before and after the reintroduction of wolves, and they found out that after the reintroduction of wolves, malnutrition was the norm for this ecology of fear status. And also they were very stressed. They had these high hormone levels with hormones related to stress states and all that. Right. So let's turn now to the species view. Well, I'm not gonna develop this in much detail. Of course, I could tackle here all the arguments to reject speciesism, but I'm not gonna do that. If anyone is interested on this, we could talk about it later. But I'm just gonna assume that a blatant opposition to considering animals is something that we should reject. Now, first of all, we should look at what is that the species view is entailing. Now, the species argument is claiming that we shouldn't intervene in nature because wild animals' interests count for little or nothing. But in fact, it needs to assume that these interests count for nothing. Because if we just care a little for wild animals, because of the aggregate interest, because there are so many, at some point we should start caring for them. I mean, we should notice that there are around 7 billion humans on Earth now, but as you mentioned before, there are, I think, like 10 to the power of 12, 10 to the power of 13 mammals, and 10 to the power of 20 invertebrates on Earth. So, you know, there is a big difference between 7 billion and 10 to the power of 20. So even if their interest counts for little, I mean, at some point we need to aggregate. So, as I said, the species argument just works if we don't consider at all the interests of animals, which I think is a far-fetched view. I mean, I don't know if some of you hold this view, we can discuss it later, but most of us really don't accept this. And then, if we assume that well-being matters, it's clear that this species view won't be acceptable either, because speciesism is unacceptable for any view concerned with well-being, either if we accept it from a utilitarian, an egalitarian, a maximum view, or any other view which considers welfare something important. So, well, as I said, since no humans have a well-being, I mean, this is perfectly clear that the harms that suffer by them should matter. And second, we could also say that impartiality blocks speciesism, because we can perfectly imagine a situation in which we were in the position in which wild animals are, and in a situation such as that, we would all prefer to be helped. So if we imagine some kind of original position in which we don't know whether we are going to be wild animals or humans, we would of course be in favor of intervention. And since most of us think that there is something right with impartiality, I mean, some people think that, yeah, we should be partial, but still they think that partiality isn't all there has to be taken into account, that some level of impartiality is necessary. So again, the conclusion would follow.